I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we analyse the ongoing invasion of Russia by the Ukrainian military and ask, with so many drones watching everything that moves, how has surprise returned to the battlefield?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 8th of August, 2 years and 171 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today I'm joined by Assistant Command Editor Francis Dearnley and former Tank Regiment Commander and Chemical Biological Weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started with the latest news from Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine's advance into Russia is continuing. So just to dial in on the geography, because we're going to be talking about this for quite some time, I think. We are now in the northeast corner of Ukraine. There's the city of Sumy in that area. We are northeast of Sumy, up on the border region and just beyond it. We're about 250 kilometres east of Kyiv, about 100 kilometres northwest of Kharkiv. And this area of fighting, this push by Ukraine across the border into Russia, is about 150 kilometres northwest along the border from where that Russian lodgement is, just north of Kharkiv. This whole area, the fighting, this invasion of Russia, is about 400 kilometres northwest of the Donbass. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. It's a separate operational area. I don't think the two are having that much impact on each other, if at all, at the moment. But I'll talk about that a bit later. So about 400 k's away from the Donbass. There are reports that Ukraine has pushed in, well, the most sensible reports I can see, the most numerous of the sensible, say about 15 kilometres into Russia. I have seen some saying they've got a little bit further. There will undoubtedly be recce elements, reconnaissance elements further forward from the main forces, and there are fires, long-range fires, artillery and what have you, beyond that. But we think the main lodgement, the main incursion is about 15 kilometres into Russia and about, roughly about the same distance, maybe slightly shorter in width. Now, at least 2 Ukrainian brigades have been identified so far as part of this push. It's the 22nd Mechanised Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. That's not giving away any operational security issues. If the Russians don't know by now, because it's all over social media, then more fool them. They are both considered to be pretty good formations. They are experienced. They're not brand new. They're not just been bolted together, built from scratch with Western equipment. They have been using some Western donated equipment. We've seen US Stryker and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. There are German Marder infantry fighting vehicles inside Russia now. It's a full mechanised force. It's not on foot or in armoured personnel carriers, battle taxis, as they're sometimes known. These are fighting vehicles that you'd use in a mechanised assault. Tanks also have been reported. I've not seen which variants they are now. There seem to be 2 axes of advance. So from this the Sumy border area, one axis of advance seems to be going due north towards the town of Koronovo. That's about 20 k's across the border, about 40 k's ish due north of Sumy city itself. The other axis seems to be directly to the east, or sort of east-northeast, towards the Russian town of Sudza. Has about 5,000 people. It's located within 10 k's of the border. I'm not sure that those 2 brigades, the 22nd and the 82nd, are taking one axis each, or if they are sort of task organised together on both axes. Now, geolocated footage from the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, shows that Ukrainian armoured vehicles have advanced at least 10 k's from the international border. That's where they've been sighted, and there are obviously reports further on from that, reports on social media. But geolocated footage shows them 10 k's in. As I say, they're likely to be further with reconnaissance elements well ahead of that. Ukraine seems to be working on the sort of Western doctrine of recce pull, i.e. the reconnaissance units, which are generally lighter in terms of the armaments they've got, but also lighter in terms of the armour they're using, so can't put up with as much of a punch as the main forces can, but hence are faster, generally a bit smaller, easier to hide. They'll be looking for gaps, and then the main force should be pulled through into those gaps to exploit success rather than reinforce failure. Now, the ISW are saying Ukrainian forces have penetrated at least 2 Russian defensive lines and a stronghold. That's interesting in the context of the defensive lines that we saw down south, the Surovikin line, the minefields and all the rest of it that proved so costly and difficult to penetrate, or impossible to penetrate in the counter-offensive last year. Now, Russian sources are saying Ukraine is trying to advance along the Sudza-Koronovo highway. So the 2 towns I mentioned, that the main road running between them and obviously continuing on. But that highway runs roughly northwest-southeast, which sort of mirrors where the border is in this part, although it does wobble around a bit. A prominent Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger said last night that Ukrainian forces are now fighting on the outskirts of both towns, and I have seen reports that Ukraine are through Sudza. It's extremely difficult to get any information out about this. Now, the Sudza gas distribution station is in Ukrainian hands. There is talk, you'll find it on social media, that the Kursk nuclear power plant, that suggestion that might be another objective. That is 40 kilometres away, so probably not an immediate objective, if one at all. If everything's going brilliantly, then that's an additional objective, but it doesn't seem to be so far. And of course, you've got to ask, well, what would they do if they got there anyway? A number of Russian prisoners of war have been taken, both conscripts and contract soldiers. This is according to the Konotchu 90 project. This was launched in January this year by Ukraine's military intelligence agency for relatives of Russian military personnel captured in Ukraine. It's that program about putting them in touch and getting their people home. It obviously helps for the propaganda purposes, for the narrative, and it also helps for the when it comes to prisoner exchanges and what have you. Now, in a statement, this group said that many had been captured. They said, quote, "There is also information about the dead whose bodies were not taken away by their comrades in arms during the retreat." There are images across social media purporting to show a very small number of Ukrainian forces. Things I've seen show only about 4 or 5, although the area of view taken from is clearly a drone is quite small, but it looks to be about a number 4 or 5 Ukrainian soldiers, with at least 40, we are led to expect to be Russian soldiers, captured and lying on the floor. They're not dead. The film I've seen, they're all standing up and then they're told to lie down, hands on their head, that kind of thing. I've counted them up, at least 40. Now, there are difficulties in extracting prisoners of war, the logistic lines, getting them back to Ukraine, but they will be useful in any future prisoner exchanges. Commenting on this, on the invasion, former Australian General Mick Ryan, we've had him on the pod before, very good chap to follow and read on his Substack as well. He says Putin has responded to this Ukrainian attack quicker than other surprises that Russia have been subjected to during this war. He points to the Prigozhin uprising last June, when the Wagner group sort of legged it up the motorway and stopped after a couple of hundred kilometres north of Rostov-on-Don. Mick Ryan says that Putin then was absent for a couple of days, didn't know where he was, didn't make any decisions. This time, however, Putin seems to be a bit more active. He held a meeting of the National Security Council yesterday, some of which was shown on Russian TV. During that meeting, he described the Ukrainian operation as, quote, another large-scale provocation. Now, also present at that meeting were Defence Minister Andrei Belousov, Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu, who you'll remember has just been replaced by Belousov as the Defence Minister. Also there was the FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov and Russia's Chief of the General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov. Gerasimov said the Ukrainian advance had been stopped. Everything was under control. There were loads of Ukrainian casualties, loads of knocked out vehicles. That's to be expected, although, we've got to say we can't verify either way as to whether or not Gerasimov's telling the truth, but I'm not seeing anything to back that up. There are mixed messages coming from Russia. They are keen, they're in a bit of a quandary, right? They're keen to use this incursion as evidence of Ukrainian aggression, but of course they don't want to admit that their forces have been overrun. The border was wiped out. They don't want to create panic in the population, give the idea that Ukraine is at all able to put up any resistance or carry out offensive operations. So they don't really know how to handle it. The Russian MOD, the Russian Ministry of Defense, edited a post that they put out initially on Tuesday when the news was first coming through about the invasion. At that time, they'd said, it's just a sabotage and reconnaissance action, and then the Ukrainian forces had retreated. That's clearly not now. They can't stick to that line anymore, so Russia MOD have had to adjust that tweet. But they've really not got their narrative together about how to respond to this. Kursk Oblast acting head, Alexei Smirnov, so the Russian Oblast regional head, he said the situation is under Putin's personal control. That's not going to win him any promotion prizes if the situation gets worse, I would venture. But he stated that several thousand Kursk Oblast civilians have already been evacuated from the area. That's doing the rounds on social media. It's too strong to say that there's panic breaking out, but of course that's not playing well at all. As you might expect, there's no official word yet from Kyiv. President Zelensky said in his evening address last night that he'd spoken to the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces, Alexander Syrsky. He said that, quote, the details would follow later. General Bogdanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, he's been very tight-lipped, as usual. He was speaking to an economic forum, I think, today in Kyiv, and he was talking about operations down south, down on the spit of land in Kherson Oblast that we talked about yesterday. So he's saying anything except what's going on up north, which is not bad for keeping operational security, and also keeps everyone guessing. Now, the BBC journalist Will Vernon, he's reporting that the invasion was organised in coordination with British intelligence services, according to the Russian MP Adalby Shagozov. Now, Mr. Shagozov said, Britain took part in all these raids, and as evidence for this, he said, people could hear English being spoken. So, they really haven't got their narrative sorted out yet. For me, just to wrap this section up, there is still no clear idea. I have no clear idea of what the objective is. It could be, as we suggested yesterday, a morale boost for the Ukrainian armed forces and for their personnel and on the international stage. It could be an effort to seize personnel and ground before any potential future negotiations or as prisoner swaps. It could be an effort to disrupt Russia's ground line of communication, the road, and more importantly, the rail network in this area, the rail line that runs kind of just behind the towns that have been taken into northern Ukraine. It might be an effort to disrupt that, but we don't know yet. I don't think anybody knows yet outside of the higher echelons of Ukraine's armed forces. So just be careful of people suggesting they know exactly what's going on. Now, briefly elsewhere, last night Russia launched 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 2 Kh-59 guided air-launched missiles, and 4 Shahed-type attack drones against Ukraine. Both Kh-59s and all 4 drones were successfully intercepted, Ukraine's Air Force said. There were a small number of casualties in Donetsk, Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kirovrad, Luhansk, Mykolaiv and Zaporizhia oblasts also came under attack, but no casualties reported there. Sumy Governor Volodymyr Archuk said on TV yesterday that his oblast, this morning said on TV, his oblast has never seen such a number of airstrikes per day as it did yesterday, calling the number of attacks unprecedented. A brother and a sister, the girl aged 6, were killed in a schoolyard, Archuk said, with 2 others injured. That was after a glide bomb strike in the region. Sumy Oblast authorities announced mandatory evacuations of 6,000 residents yesterday. And then down into the Donbass, Russia's continued efforts in the vicinity of Toretsk, but no confirmed advances there. They've pushed slightly forward to the southwest of Donetsk city, but also Ukraine has retaken some land south of Chasiv Yar. Essentially, there's no big changes to the tempo of operations in the Donbass as a result of the Kursk invasion, although given the distances involved, like I say, about 400 kilometres between the 2 areas, it's unlikely either will really impact the other unless there are very, very significant changes to the disposition of forces and the location of the front lines. I think these are 2 very separate, for now, very separate operational level actions. And just very, very briefly, when I talk about operational level, at the most basic, you have sort of tactical actions. Those are the individual movements of personnel and tanks and what have you. Tactics, taking a village, taking a tree line, etc., etc. At the very top, you have strategic stuff about quite where the direction of the war is going to go, which allies have you got lined up. But it's where the military and the political meet. In the middle, you have the operational level. So I think this is 2 operational level actions at the moment. I think you've got the fight in the Donbass. This might peter out, but if it develops into something, you've got this push by Ukraine into Russia in the northeast. And for now, I see them as 2 separate operational level actions. They may well knit together. If not physically, then conceptually, because one might start to impact the other if either side has to move forces from one area to the other. But for now, I think they are separate. I'm going to take a little pause there, come back a bit later. But Francis, what are you looking at, both in regard to this and elsewhere from the diplomatic and political front?
Well, thanks, Dom. I think it is worth taking a moment just to reflect further on the political significance of this attack on Kursk, both internally within Ukraine and externally as far as its allies are concerned, remembering Clausewitz's maxim. When the attack began, as we reported yesterday, there was considerable concern that this may well have been ill-advised in military terms, given the pressure being exerted by the Russians on other sectors of the front. That was the common refrain from military commentators and many journalists who have been stationed at various points around the front in recent weeks. But the mood this morning has noticeably shifted. The inroads the Ukrainian forces have made and the optics you just described there of Russian soldiers surrendering has led to many more people making positive remarks today about the wisdom of the decision to make this manoeuvre. The author of one critical thread yesterday has now put it as follows: I still think this could be a serious mistake given the situation in the Donbass. However, the situation can quickly change, proving me wrong. Overall, it's unlikely that we are nearing the end of the operation, so my conclusions are early and preliminary. My hope is for a total victory by the AFU forces, allowing me to write a follow-up apology thread acknowledging how far my initial assessment was wrong. So just to give you a sense there of the way in which reassessments are happening very much in real time. Militarily, of course, this could still be a gambit that does not pay off. But politically, in Ukraine itself and as far as Western powers are concerned, this is already arguably a successful operation. The talk about negotiations, of course, is stoked by Russian advances on the front line and the relative lack of Ukrainian progress in that regard. Operations will force many to reassess their assumptions about what Kyiv is capable of and indeed would be able to do with further support. When you see actions like this, it leads, and you can see it happening, literally, as I say, in real time. People saying, my God, I had no idea they still had it in them. That is why this matters. It far transcends military strategy alone. Though, of course, it could prove highly significant there too, for the reasons that Dom just mentioned. You could see in a situation where forces are forced to leave some of those pressurised points on the front in order to try and destabilise this new offensive by Ukraine. Stories like this, though, attract positive headlines for Kyiv. And whilst it may sound trite in the grand scheme of life and death, that really does matter when one is fighting a war that depends on one maintaining the support of other powers. And that's before we even get into the internal impact within Ukraine itself. It's far too early to say what impact this will have on some of the polling that we've discussed recently, but there is some evidence that at least temporarily this has boosted morale after what has been a pretty blankly depressing few months on the news front. Among that depressing news, of course, are the continuing concerning stories about the state of Ukrainian soldiers in Russian captivity. As I discussed last week following the prisoner swap for journalists and dissidents, we mustn't forget the thousands of prisoners of war that remain in terrible conditions in Russian prisoner of war camps. And just to underline this point, the head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Daniel Bell, stated that Russia has tortured 95% of Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian detention. 95%. She stated in an interview with Dutch TV that Russian authorities torture Ukrainian POWs from their very first interrogations, and that it is characterised, the process therein. Torturing Ukrainian POWs is, she said, widespread and systematic. And that would tally with what we've reported and heard from various sources for many, many months, indeed years now. And for the most lucid account of Russian torture, I would point listeners to the episode we did where we interviewed ex-soldier Shaun Pinner, and we'll add a link in the description to that remarkable testimony of him. And just to underline further that despite the events of last week, suppression within Russia itself does continue at pace. Russian-American ballerina Ksenia Karelyenya has pleaded guilty to treason charges after she was arrested for donating money to a charity supporting Ukraine. Russian prosecutors are seeking a 15-year sentence after the security services accused her of collecting money that could be used to purchase tactical supplies for the Ukrainian army. She was detained by authorities in Yekaterinburg, east of Moscow, after a family visit in February. So again, this is still ongoing, and given that she is half American as far as her passport is concerned, this is perhaps yet another example of somebody who will be a helpful bargaining chip in future prisoner exchanges. And that is, of course, why there were concerns, which are important to raise, about the precedent that the events of last week set, however welcome they may be on a case-by-case basis. In other news, John, just before we wrap up on this section, another quick update from Estonia, where the government is beefing up checks at the Russian border to tighten sanctions. The Estonians emphasise that this is being done to prevent the entry of sanctioned goods into Russia. And to quote Finance Minister directly, this declared destination is often listed as a third country, but we do not believe this. Practice shows that on the way to the destination, usually located in Asian countries, these goods are halted halfway somewhere in Russia. Among these goods are many suspicious items, such as military goods, dual-use goods, or cash. It's a very interesting development given the critiques that have been made about the use of third-party nations to smuggle material into Russia. Clearly, the Estonians, unsurprisingly given their geography and threat level, are one of the countries pursuing this first. But nonetheless, it does bear repeating that there are many other countries that are able to more easily smuggle or just directly sell material into Russia because they are not involved in the sanctions program. And that what we're seeing is countries where there are no restrictions on what one is selling to other countries that are selling, say, drone parts to Kyrgyzstan or another country like that, and then they just are going straight into Russia, which is why you see situations where 1,000% increase in sales of certain machine parts goes up in these bizarre countries because they are then being sold on to Russia. And clearly the approach that's being pushed for by many entities concerned about this is that if businesses are or have evidence that the material that they are selling to these countries is then going on to Russia, that should be banned or made much more difficult to take place. But that is difficult. That is a very, very difficult loophole to shut. And that is why, of course, it is taking time. But interesting that the Estonians are looking into it. But that's where we are, Dom, in terms of the main stories today. A rare, quieter day in the political realm. But we must not forget the importance in the political sense of what is happening and unfolding in Kursk as we speak.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. As you were talking there about that report from the UN about the torture inflicted upon Ukrainian prisoners of war, I just made a note that in my military experience I was a trained interrogator, and torture is just not only is it abhorrent on a human level, it just doesn't work, because all they do, the person subjected to torture, they'll just tell you whatever they think you want to hear to make it stop. So it's utterly unreliable. There's no point in doing it whatsoever. Now, what we would do is a process called conditioning, whereby you control everything. You control the environment. You deprive the prisoner of information. Most importantly, we human beings, we're inquisitive animals. We like to know what's going on. We like to know the time. We like to know where we are. We like to know what time I'm going to get fed, all this kind of stuff. So deprive them of information, deprive them of comfort, deprive them of control over themselves and their environment. But you don't. There are basic and sensible human needs that you have to attend to. Now, all that conditioning is there to make the individual want to talk to you, because they generally will have nobody else there in their cell or what have you. So you want them to talk to you. You've got to find the right motivation. If it's their ego, you sort of flatter them by saying, well, of course, you'd know all the plans because you're so important, all that kind of stuff. Or fear, you shout at them, and some people say, oh, no, stop shouting at me. But you don't lay hands on them. You don't torture them. That is just utterly abhorrent. It doesn't work. And that's been unfortunately proven time and time again. So quite why it's happening still speaks more of the individual and the system than any kind of military necessity whatsoever. But Francis, before we move on to Hamish, I've got a question for you, if I may. Mick Ryan was talking, or I mentioned Mick Ryan earlier on, comparing what's happening now with the Prigozhin dash, the mutiny, the Wagner mutiny, when they last June when they were heading up the motorway from Rostov towards Moscow. Now that met with little to no resistance, or it met very little resistance. It certainly wasn't stopped by Russian forces. It only stopped when Prigozhin decided to call it a day. How much of a risk do you think there is now for Putin if the Ukrainians don't decide to call it a day in the next few days or next week? They rampage for as far and wide as they wish to, and just keep going. And then, if and when they eventually, I'm not saying they will do, but if they do decide to withdraw in good order back to Ukraine and show through social media and video and what have you that it was their decision, how much of a risk is that for Putin?
Well, I think we need to be careful on making too many comparisons between what's going on in Kursk and Prigozhin, just purely in the sense of the political significance, because, of course, the real value of Prigozhin's mutiny, as far as the Ukrainian cause was concerned, was the fact that it was evidence of internal strife, and indeed extremely serious internal strife. As listeners who were listening then will recall, I think it's fair to say collectively as a podcast, were very sceptical that Prigozhin could be successful because he was seen as an outsider as far as the Russian elite were concerned, a fringe maverick figure, which meant that it was very unlikely that he would be able to cause serious threat of overthrow of Putin. And it doesn't really appear that was something that was his direct motivator, though I'm sure it was in the back of his mind that, if things go really well, maybe, who knows, I'll be running Russia by the end of the month. But anyway, so I think that was the real value of that event in historical terms, as opposed to the military elements of, the fact of how far they got towards Moscow. I think the geography of Moscow, though, was very relevant to this too. It's hugely significant when you have forces rampaging that close to the capital. As we've talked about on the podcast many times before, we mustn't forget the significance strategically of Moscow and Petersburg in Russia. It's very different than a lot of other countries where, of course, any territory is disastrous for an enemy force to control or have influence over. In Russia, it's unbalanced. If you control or are causing disruption in Moscow and St. Petersburg, then the real regime itself is imperiled. And that has been proven the case for numerous examples of Russian history, all the way back to the 19th century, let alone the 20th and what we saw going on with the February and October revolutions and beyond. So I just draw attention to that it is interesting to think about the political ramifications of this, but I would say that the political value of Prigozhin was totally different than what's going on in Kursk, which at the end of the day is a foreign force in Russia. Nonetheless, all of that said, I think there is value in talking about how damaging the optics are by having a force that is effectively able to do what it likes on your territory. And that is similar to what Prigozhin was able to show up for Russia. I think what really shocked people with the Prigozhin mutiny, and of course we were following it live and even did a special podcast as it was unfolding, was how far they were able to get without any resistance, really. And part of that possibly was because the Russian armed forces weren't really sure what to do. Part of it may have been because they secretly, many elements were sympathetic. We have rumours, of course, that within the Russian state, there were some who were sympathetic to what Prigozhin was doing and may indeed have turned something of a blind eye and not immediately sought to shut down this mutiny by Prigozhin. But nonetheless, fundamentally, he got pretty far, and this is, as you say, if the Ukrainians continue, it gets worse. What may once just be seen, if it lasts a day or so, as a minor incursion, as we see sometimes happening in Belgorod, becomes something of an actual major issue. And as you were saying earlier on, from Putin's perspective, he's in a real bind here, because on the one hand, he's trying to portray himself as being in a situation where everything is going extremely well militarily, that his negotiating hand is only growing stronger by the day, and that, we were only speaking a matter of days ago about the idea that as the current state of play would appear, it would be that Russia has a stronger hand going into negotiations come November, and that's very, very powerful. All of a sudden, you have incidents like this, and it changes the narrative. And he can't afford to have this becoming a major, major crisis, which is why I think we're going to have to expect there to be some sort of quite sharp response militarily soon. But The challenge is, of course, to your point, is that he will want to try and make something of this to push in propaganda terms that, Ukraine is the aggressor in this war, which of course it isn't, but that will be of power for him. But he can't do that without showing up the weaknesses of Russian forces. So it's a really challenging situation in propaganda terms. And I don't envy those who are trying to come up with narratives around this in the Kremlin because, on the one hand, there are strengths, but on many others, there are huge weaknesses. So it's a bit of a conundrum, Dom, really. And I think we should just urge caution. It is very early days. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some sort of orderly withdrawal by the Ukrainians because this was mainly designed for morale purposes or indeed to potentially draw resources away from some of the pressured front lines. And yet at the same time, who knows? We do not know the operational strategy that's in place here. And if they do continue, then I think we can expect this, what may once at the moment be considering a minor crisis, to become a fully fledged one, which will require a total reassessment of the narratives that have been being discussed most openly in Western capitals now for many, many months due to the stress that the Ukrainian forces are under. And that shift in narrative could be very significant in terms of the events that we're leading towards in November and beyond. So one to continue monitoring very closely indeed.
Thanks, Francis. Right, that's enough of the conceptual element of fighting power. Let's get back down to the physical. Hamish, delighted to have you back on the pod. Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. Last time I saw you, we were arm in arm admiring your lovely camouflage jacket at the bar of the Chalk Valley Festival. I think we would have been described as tired and emotional. Chalk Valley Festival, by the way, folks, absolutely fantastic. Do go next year. I highly recommend it. Hamish, I'll be keen on your thoughts on what you think is happening in Kursk at the moment. And Francis and I have used up today's quota of the word narrative, so you're not allowed to use that word. But be keen on your analysis in a moment. But could I start off, please, by I've been thinking about this. This war has introduced much to the battlefield. Drones, persistent surveillance, electronic warfare, blah, 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 lots of innovation. The term transparent battlefield has been introduced as well. But for all the things that have been introduced, we thought that one thing had been removed, and that was the element of surprise. So, Hamish, how important is surprise? How do you think it was achieved here? And how do you go about hiding a multi-brigade effort once that operational surprise is lost? Hamish, welcome back to the pod.
Yeah, I mean, this operation is fascinating on so many levels. And as you say, the surprise thing we thought had gone with the multiple drones, the surveillance assets, and everything else. How on earth do you achieve surprise? Because actually, as you say, this is in what we call in British terms sort of battle group level operation. We've got apparently 11 or so tanks, a squadron of tanks, a couple of companies of infantry fighting vehicles, artillery assets, air defence assets, and all the enablers. And one thing we need to talk about is extended lines, because you need to fuel these vehicles, you need to ammo them up, and you need to fuel the soldiers. And that's not an insignificant task. But if you just laid this thing on the ground without much dispersion, it would cover a couple of kilometres. And we're led to believe, how on earth can you hide that? But I expect one thing is probably the Russians have assumed that, and people become very reliant on technology. When they've got wall-to-wall drones looking at things, they become lazy. So I think actually, still deception and camouflage is key. I think the other element to it, not to use the narrative word, all the activity in the last few weeks and months has been elsewhere. And we know that the Ukrainians are very canny. And in preparation of the battlefield, as we call it, before you do an operation, you want to make sure everything is going in your direction. All of that activity and all the stuff on social media and all the intelligence coming out of Kyiv on the pro-Ukrainian side has given absolutely no indication that there was going to be a counter move or whatever we want to call it in this part of the world. The idea was to dislocate, is a military term, but catch the Russians off balance. And by golly, have they managed to do this? You were talking about tactical operations, Dom, a minute ago. I mean, this is a classic tactical operation that's had a strategic impact. I sort of mean that by the fact that Putin's got directly involved and got his long screwdriver involved. And when you have tactical operations in effect commanded at strategic level, you lose complete flexibility, you lose the ability of junior commanders to think for themselves, which is why I think 48 hours down the line, we haven't seen a Russian reaction, except for Peskov and Medvedev claiming that Wagner are there fighting. The last time I looked, or yesterday, Wagner were in Mali. How they got from Central Africa to Central Europe in 24 hours, Lord knows. But going back to your point about surprise, absolutely, I think it reinforces, and I was only talking to various people involved in training our young officers, and they had their final exercise the other day, about how key it is that you don't forget the basics of soldiery, that just because you've got drones, you've got deep fires available, precision and all the rest of it, actually the things that have been successful since the year dot, surprise, camouflage, agility, doing the unexpected, still absolutely hold true here. I think the other thing that is evident, and we've spoken about it in the past, this idea of combined arms manoeuvre, where you have tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, the Bradleys, Strikers, etc., air defence, all working together. We haven't really seen that in the last 2.5 years. We've seen very basic type of operations at the conventional level. And conventional, I'm not talking about nukes and all the rest of it. I'm talking about conventional rather than sort of special forces. But the ability to, as you said, attack on two lines and make progress shows a level of coordination that we haven't seen. And I am surprised that they've done it. But as you said, the two regular units involved, 22nd Mech and 82 Air Assault, and certainly 82 Air Assault, who I know Jimmy Rushton's been with a lot, are really very well trained and motivated. And they must have been doing an awful lot of training to be able to achieve this type of operation. So, the other bit that you said at the beginning, the fact that they have broken through. Now, I understand there must have been a complete electronic warfare sort of blanket 24 hours or 12 hours before this operation kicked off, and led, I understand, by massive amounts of FPV drones and others. And the fact that the Russian forces on the border just sort of crumbled and surrendered was a surprise, I think, again, because it was so unexpected. Another classic element to warfare. If you're bold and do the unexpected, particularly against poorly trained and motivated troops, then you can have this impact. So a very long answer to your original piece, Dom. I think all of those young boys and girls who have been trained at the various establishments across the UK, all the basics that they're learning, I hope they realise now quite how important they are, and you just can't rely on jazzy technology to get you through. Some things just don't change.
No, absolutely. And interesting you mentioned deception there in your answer, deception being the sort of the bedfellow of surprise. I note when it comes to deception, just in the last 2 hours, Ukraine's Ministry of Defence tweeted, President Zelensky has said F-16s are already in Ukrainian skies and there will be more, unquote. Now, we know that. That happened last week. They made a great old song and dance about it last week about F-16s in Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. So pushing that line again has got to be linked to this Kursk invasion. What do you think is going on here through the lens of deception? Why is Ukraine pushing this line again that we already know that F-16s are in country?
Well, again, both you and Francis are talking about the psychological operations here. I've already seen, I'm sure as you guys have on social media, that apparently F-16s are buzzing around above the troops already and are part of the successful incursion. I would be incredibly surprised if the 10 or so F-16s that Ukraine now has are flying around the border. But the psychological impact, although we know that social media is fairly limited to the Russian troops who are opposing it, this stuff does get through. And when you have a marked piece of equipment like an F-16 that everybody's built up as being completely invulnerable and a fantastic bit of kit, of course, you want to develop these myths and turn them into reality. I'm not at all surprised that Kyiv are suggesting that F-16s are buzzing around there. And I'm sure, other elements too. I think of the deception and surprise. You mentioned at the beginning, of course, unsurprisingly, the Russians are saying that the Brits are involved here. Well, I take that as a great compliment. We always talk about how our tiny little military needs to get uprated and ready for the 21st century. But if the Russians are saying the only reason that Ukraine is being successful is because of us, then excellent. I'm sure they're not sort of British soldiers on the front line with the Ukrainians, but I would hope NATO intelligence is enabling and helping this type of operation, because of course the Ukrainians must prevail and get into a position where they can sort ceasefire and negotiate from a position of strength. And I'm sure there is a lot of other stuff going on at the moment. And going back to our deception and the transparent battlefield, the fact that we really don't know exactly what's going on sort of personifies that too. And the fact that the Russians don't, I find pretty staggering. But it goes back to my point about, if you are controlling the lowest level operations from the highest level of command, i.e. the president, you cannot expect to have any sort of ability for your junior commanders to react with what we call mission command and achieve success. And I'm not at all surprised that the Russians haven't managed to get. I mean, they don't appear to have a mobile reserve, or if they do, it's nowhere near this area, because part of the deception as well, and you guys will have a view on this, all the talk for the last few weeks has been about Crimea. We've all been expecting the bridge to be flattened and for Ukrainian Marines to be landing on Crimea. We couldn't have been, or I couldn't have been sort of further from the truth. So it is a fascinating operation. And it'd be interesting. I expected that force to be withdrawing today, because, I know how much fuel and ammunition you need to support this. Admittedly, they're only 15 kilometres across the border. And a tank will do a couple of 100 kilometres before needing to be refueled. But having said that, you still need to keep those lines open. But the fact that there seems to be so little Russian activity, where is the Russian Air Force, for instance? There are a few videos going around yesterday of some Russian fighters buzzing around. There are a few videos of alleged knocked out Ukrainian vehicles, but nothing that's substantiated. And at the moment, the Ukrainians seem to be pushing on relatively unhindered.
Indeed. Now, last one for me, Hamish, if I may. I was delighted to hear last night in my latest Netflix binge. I'm watching Designated Survivor. I'm struggling, to be honest. Friends in the US. If do I need to persevere? Kiefer Sutherland, he's just not. He's not the vampire he once was. So the line in Designated Survivor was amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. I was delighted to see that come out again, one of my favourites. Now, do you think the logistic difficulties in sustaining a force such as this give any pointers? And you've just alluded to these, but do they give any pointers to what you think the objectives of this might be?
I think they do on the face of it, but what we don't know is what is that logistic tail? What is built up behind it to keep it going? But I tend to agree that actually when you look at this looks to be a short counter move. Allegedly, there is a build-up of 75,000 Russian forces in the area. There's pressure elsewhere, as you've talked about. But this was, I think, a counter move to dislocate the Russian high command. And to me, it's been successful. I wouldn't be surprised if the operation has reached, again, a word we've used many times, its culminating point. It's reached the point where they will not achieve a lot more by keep pushing on. But we could very well be wrong. This has caught us by surprise. But I think this is one of the most definitive tactical operations that we have seen by the Ukrainians, perhaps throughout this war. We shall see. But the fact that it's headline news with everything else that's going along, the fact that it seemed to be panicking Putin, and even yesterday Putin was having to give his air defense to the Iranians. He is now reaping what he sows, because there's obviously flipping air defense on the border to protect his troops in the Kursk region. And the final thing I would say on this is, of course, Kursk has been the graveyard of the previous tyrant who stormed across Europe. The Battle of Kursk 1943 was sort of the beginning of the end of the Nazis' and Hitler, when in the most bloody of battles, 4,000 tanks on both sides destroyed hundreds of thousands of men. The Russians actually prevail then with pure blood and numbers, and it saw the Nazis pretty much, that was the beginning of their end. Let's hope this Kursk operation has a similar positive impact for the Ukrainians.
If I could just jump in both, I think Hamish has just made a very interesting point there, the historical comparison with Kursk, because it is another element that may have some symbolic value here as far as the Ukrainians are concerned. It was only a matter of months ago that Putin was talking about the Battle of Kursk very publicly as part of his propaganda campaign, with the usual figures behind him from the war. And so I think, that will be hard to appreciate for many listeners around the world. But for Russians, it's a huge battle, and one that the fact that this is now taking place in that kind of area does cut through. But the question I had to both of you is, given what we've discussed today, you're right, Hamish, that there is a lot of headlines that have been drawn around the world on this story, but I wonder whether it should be more prominent than it is. So I suppose my question is for both of you, perhaps Hamish first and then Dom, if I may, is, do you think this is an operation that warrants more attention that it's receiving, or do you think that we're at about the right level in terms of the observation of it?
That's a really good observation, Francis. And I think with everything else that is happening in the world at the moment, and funny enough, I've just done an interview for a radio station, and the sort of introduction, well, Ukraine is back in the news at last. And I was sort of thinking, if a national radio station is just saying that, and the fact that Ukraine has been out of the news because of what's happening in this country and what's happening in the Middle East, where I think as we've discussed, and those of us who've looked very closely at it, what happens in Ukraine has the potential to have a greater impact on this country than on virtually anything else that's going on at the moment. It is a timely reminder. And, crikey, the Ukrainians don't need that, and people in Kyiv don't need that. But the rest of the world, as they settle in to look at other things, it's crucial that they don't forget what's happening. The only other thing that we've sort of touched on briefly is the whole sort of WMD issue around this, which again, as I think is a chimera rather than an anathema, but it's a timely reminder, and the reminder shouldn't be required. And let's hope that our new government, with its focus on so many other things, realizes that actually, success of Ukraine is absolutely essential to the security of this country in the next couple of years and decades.
I think what's interesting, and you say, have we got the right balance of commentary? I think so. I don't see anyone being too overblown. I note, so you mentioned Tatargami's post today. I thought that was a very, very mature. That sounds so patronising, but it was absolutely the right thing to say, because I was a bit surprised yesterday by how strident Tatargami was with being critical of this incursion. And they've come out today and said, actually, they may have got it wrong and it's too soon to tell. And they look forward to writing an apology. It's like, well, what a refreshing approach to discourse and debate and analysis. So, yet again, there's a site to follow. And as I said yesterday, for those that didn't hear, I was put on to Tatargami by Defence Secretary Ben Wallace when he was in post as Defence Secretary. He said, look, here's someone to follow. Here's where he gets a lot of information from. So, I don't know who the individual is, but I do rate their analysis. And I like that thread of humanity there. I think that's very important. But the three things that I think really come out of this that we can talk about, we can point to, without overblowing it. I think, number one, this advance puts what we're seeing in the Donbass into context. These slow, grinding, incremental advances by Russia, meters a day, hundreds of meters, okay, maybe a kilometre a day, at extreme cost. It just shows what a rubbish way of doing warfare that is. Secondly, it puts last year's and this year's counteroffensive into context, i.e., how a well-prepared defensive line such as Russia had can seriously unhinge an attacker. And what lessons do you draw from that? Number one, dig one, as we've been saying for months, and echoing others. Francis Farrow in particular has been very big voice on this. Ukraine, where was your defensive line? Get it dug. Get them dug. And secondly, if you are faced with that, such an obstacle, bypass it. And maybe this is one of the biggest right hooks of all time. We don't know, but don't go straight into the lion's mouth to go around the sides if you can. So I think it really puts those two in stark relief. And just finally, it shows that Ukraine can do combined arms manoeuvre, albeit at a low level. We think this is brigade size. No, it's no small fry, but it's not core, it's not massive, it's not an army size, but they can do combined arms manoeuvre when not being asked to do the hardest thing a military force can, which is an offensive attack into a pre-prepared defensive position, which was exactly what they were asked to do in the counter-offensive last year. So I've said it before, and I look forward to saying it again. This Russian army can be beaten. And here you see some fairly low-level number of forces. We're talking small double digits of armoured vehicles that are punched into Russia. I mean, it's just mad when you think about it. What the headlines gone from 3 days when you'll be in Kyiv to 2.5 years later you've been invaded. I mean, the first time since 1943. Absolutely incredible stuff. It shows what Ukraine can do, and it shows what this Russian force is like when they come up against a proper, well-organised, well-trained, well-equipped enemy. So I don't think we're overblowing it. I think we're getting the pace just about right. We will continue to report on this, of course, with the accuracy and the fidelity that you rightly hold us to account for. Let me move, please, chaps, to final thoughts. And Francis, can I come to you first, please?
Thanks, Dom, and thanks for answering that question. I think you're absolutely right that we need to always be thinking about how we are reporting on this stuff, and it's great that listeners also hold our feet to the fire, as it were. And on that point, by the time most of you listen to this at home, I will have done an Ask Me Anything on Reddit later on, following in Dom's footsteps. And I just mention it here because I know that many listeners have questions about this war, and we do our best to answer them on social media when we can, and of course try and reply to those we receive by email on the podcast. But if you want to have a single page where some of those most frequently asked questions are answered, then I'll add a link in the show notes to that Ask Me Anything, which is happening this afternoon about 2:30 British time, 9:30 Eastern time. And you'll be able to see after the fact those questions answered by myself. Hopefully, I'll do it justice. And I imagine as well that there'll be some questions about the podcast and about who's the best dressed of you and David. Answer neither of you, and other similar little snippets like that. But mostly, of course, it will be discussing some of the assessments that we've made over the course of the last 2.5 years and 650 episodes, and indeed where we think the war is going. So if you're interested in looking at that, I'll add a link in the show notes.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter or X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.